This is the Cleveland Real Estate Investor Podcast, and on this episode, Reilly and Mike Ferrante talk about when to pull your house off the market and how to use market feedback to make informed decisions on what work you need to do in your house. They also discuss realtors and how choosing the wrong realtor can be dangerous, but you also have to be a seller that is receptive to proper counsel from a good realtor. That and much more. Stay tuned. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hi, this is Mike Ferrante with Century 21 Homestar and the 21 Mike team. And let's be honest, sometimes selling a house can be a real hassle. If you're in the Heights area, you have to worry about those pesky point of sale violations. You have to do other preparations to get your house ready for showings. And what about staging? That's why we work with Reilly Painting and Contracting to help sellers get top dollar for their house. So give us a call at 216-373-7727 or email info@21mike.com. The 21 Mike team, your one-stop shop for buying and selling.
Hi, everybody. This is Mike Reilly with my buddy Mike Ferrante from Century 21. Hi, Mike. How you doing?
Hey, doing great, Mike. Glad to be here again.
Well, today's issue is ER Dr. Mike, the realtor. By day, realtor. By night, emergency room doctor. So our episode, it's going to be a short and quick one, will be about rescuing a deal, and especially if you want this deal to be rescued. So, Dr. Mike, give us some of the cases you've been working on.
Very good. Yeah, that's a good intro. We were talking yesterday. What prompted this was sometimes you have a deal that just it's laying there on the table and flatlining, and you just think, man, there's no way we're bringing this one back. But you never give up. You know, if, like you said, if you want to save it. So we had one where there were some structural issues, apparent structural issues, I should say, and that was the big issue with this particular property. And we went and got the right people in place to handle it, talk about it. You know, we got a structural report from an engineer, and we ended up negotiating a pretty fair compromise. And guess what? The deal's going to close. So we slapped the paddles on it, zapped it, and we're going to be able to save that one.
And that just goes to show you the power of this hot market we are in. Because if that had been a year or two ago, instead of getting a $5,000 price break on a $190,000 offer, you kicked them back $5,000 to do, the structural repairs.
Yep.
The buyer probably would have said, "No, I want 30, 40,000 off."
Or what is more likely, Mike, is they would have said, "No, we'll just buy something else," because that was the state of the market. "Oh, I don't like this one. I'll take that one." But now buyers don't have as many choices, so they're more receptive to taking on an imperfect property.
Right. Also, keep in mind that the seller, in this case, your client, the seller needs to get real about what they can get out of this sale. Going into it, the seller was jacked up in terms of just pricing it to the moon, right?
Yeah, right.
And of course,
yeah.
they're getting cheered on by, their friends and relatives saying, "Well, geez, you should be able to get X." When in reality, you don't want to be getting too greedy here because, if you're in a hot market, you can just watch the competitive bids come in and let them start getting into a bidding war. So instead of, let's say you're selling something for $200,000 and your friends are saying, "Man, you should get $225 for this or $230." Well, why don't you just, instead of knocking a lot of people out at that price point, put it at $200 and then let the bidding war begin? Because the irony of it is you may even get $240. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as we've been saying, right now the list price is kind of the starting price. But what is interesting though is we're taking our best guess where things are going to end up. So we say, hey, let's start at 200. The market tells you what a property is worth. I know it sounds trite to say, but market value is what someone is willing to pay for it. And if you really let that sink in for a second, if let's say we're optimistic, we say, yeah, maybe low 200s. Let's start it at 200 and see what happens. If you're on the market for a week, 2 weeks, that's an eternity. I keep saying that is an eternity in this market. And God forbid you're on the market for 30 days and you're not getting those offers in that bidding war. Guess what? The writing's on the wall. That property isn't worth 225 or 240. If it's listed at 200 and someone throws 190s at you, guess what? That's market value.
Right. Also, buyers are a little bit nervous because they don't want to be overpaying. They don't want to wake up with the hangover they had 8 years ago.
Yep.
Or 10 years ago.
Valid concern, Mike, that buyer's remorse that, oh man, I got in a bidding war. It's like being in an auction. Those of you who've been at auctions, you have that frenzy that, oh, that guy just outbid me, and it becomes personal. Well, I'm going to bid higher. And you realize that you bid higher than you intended to because you got sucked up in the frenzy.
Right. And now you're, maybe in a year or two, instead of building equity, now you're on the other side of the equation. Now that house that you overpaid by $30,000, the market's corrected itself, and now it's worth $30,000 less.
Yeah. And in a past podcast, we talked about the possibility of a bubble, and we both agreed this doesn't look like a bubble, but you could have isolated incidents where, because of the bidding frenzy and the dire need of a buyer to have a property in a certain location, maybe for that property they overpaid. And I agree with you 100%. They may be in a negative equity position in a year because they paid based on need.
Right. Let's take a look. There's a couple of areas that we're aware of, the Fernway area, the Royal Heights area, where I think right now the true valuation is very close to the top. In fact, it may even be a little bit over what the true market value is going to be in the next year or two. It's sort of like buying a stock. A year and a half ago, if you had bought Zoom stock at 30, within a year, it was 150, the stock. Well, in the last couple of weeks, last month or two, that stock has gone down. That stock's down to like 75. Now, you still doubled your money if you bought it at 30, but imagine those people that bought that stock for 150 only to see their valuation on that stock reduced by 100, 50%. And that's, I think, what could happen with some of these overheated neighborhoods. Not that necessarily Cleveland is an overheated market like, the LA market, but there are pockets there that are really getting overheated. And I think buyers are starting to realize that. And I think they're getting a little bit more cautious. So you don't want to be overly aggressive in what your initial price is. Jump in here, Mike.
Yeah, I agree 100%. No, you were on a roll. I didn't want to break your train of thought, but I agree 100%. And that what's happening is there's this fine balance between what's happening in the market and the hype. There's a limit. There's a limit to what people will pay. I kind of jokingly will tell someone, hey, we're priced at 200. We think you should price at 200. Yeah, but everything is selling over list price. So shouldn't we price higher? And I say, well, great. By that mentality, if it's, maybe we should price at 300 and then it'll sell for 3.25, right? And they kind of look at me and laugh and say, well, no, I mean, obviously not that high. But I say, the right number is the one that generates interest and some competition and urgency on the part of buyers. Because if you sit on the market, Mike, you talk about this all the time, that stale, stagnant property that ends up in the dead zone.
Right. Now we've sold a couple of our rental properties, and we got more than what we thought we initially could get. The Harvey Road property, the Blanche 2 property. But then we had the Burlington property that we priced pretty aggressively at 250. And we were getting some offers that were a little bit lower than that. And finally I decided, let's just pull this off the market. because it was getting into week 3, and we were getting ready to rent it. We had a great rental deal going on, so we just pulled it off the market, but we got a lot of good market feedback where we realized that this house that we probably would have had valuated around 175 2 years ago, we know that the floor on this is at 230. And we got great feedback from the market about what they're looking at. New windows. There were a lot of questions about the windows.
Right.
Maybe a few questions about the bathroom, but not as much as I thought. But the windows, I think we're going to address that maybe in the off season and then put it back on the market and see where we are.
And to circle this back to our medical analogy, that was kind of like the checkup. We say temperature check, but that was kind of like the checkup. So we went in for a checkup. We found out what some of the weak spots might be. And now, next time you go to market that property, what you might improve to increase the top dollar.
Right. Now, you talked about resuscitating that deal, and you had a healthy patient. I'm going to use the analogy about patient being the market. It was a very healthy market. So you could pull that deal out, where 2 years ago you couldn't have.
Probably not. Yeah.
You couldn't have saved that deal. So knowing when to hold them and knowing when to fold them, or like they say in medical terms, the triage. I mean, when do you take that deal off of life support? And I think that there are some cases where people are just way too aggressive in terms of what they're pricing and the amount of work they're not doing on a property. They just think this house that just looks terrible from the street, somehow in this market, people are going to see a beauty, when in reality they see it for what it is, and the market's not budging, and there's no amount of resuscitation that you're going to do to rescue that. So what you need to take it off of life support, meaning you need to take it off the market and reset and do a little bit of work on this, and then bring it back to the market maybe 6 months later. Your thoughts, doctor?
So I would agree. That's like putting it into rehab. So you put it in the rehab facility, they do their physical therapy, in this case, it's whatever improvements are needed. And then, when you're ready to graduate out of the rehab facility, you go back out in the world and do your thing. So,
well, maybe you induce a coma. That'd be another phrase to use.
Yeah.
Again, we're getting into our my investor got shot kind of stories.
Yeah. No, but it's true. There's a point where you either, cut your losses, maybe you got gangrene in the foot and you cut the foot off and move on. But there's the other point where, if you can put the pieces together, get the right people, whether it's a contractor to do a repair or improvement. In our case, there was the structural engineer who was able to paint the picture that enabled us to reach a compromise with buyer and seller. But you have your team in place, compare it to your team of doctors and nurses in the ER, and sometimes you save the patient and sometimes you don't.
Right. And that's where you get into, for us to keep milking this analogy, the qualified doctor, the qualified realtor. And I think one sign of a qualified doctor in my book has always been somebody who's willing to think outside the box in terms of cure.
Yep.
And no, we're going to figure out a way to save this patient. And there's just millions of stories like that.
So many, Mike. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've had, and I'm not necessarily criticizing my peers, but I think they see this impossible thing to overcome. Oh, this deal's dead. And they're ready to just sign a mutual release, which is the document that terminates the agreement and both parties go on their merry ways. But I'm not always willing to give up on that patient. And, there have been times when one side was ready to give up and we said, well, hey, what if we explored this? And we start going down that road. And sometimes it pans out and sometimes it doesn't. I'm not here to say that I'm some kind of miracle worker, but sometimes there's an additional conversation or two to be had to make sure that there isn't a way to save the patient.
Yeah. And sometimes the patient needs to follow the doctor's advice. I mean, how many cases have I seen, growing up where somebody is a heavy smoker, they got emphysema. The doctor says, man, you got to quit smoking. And you see them with an oxygen tank in a wheelchair and they're still smoking.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And so I think there are some deals, everybody has these in their profession where this is just unsavable. The client is not listening to what you're saying. They're adamant that I want to get X. I don't want to put anything in. The new buyer will do this. And you're under contract with them. And, we've seen this happen before where you just simply say, all right, I got my sign out in front. I'm getting free advertising. And 6 months later, they, maybe they, they found religion. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it happens both ways. There have been times over my real estate career, 12, 13 years here, where I've been on both sides of it, where oftentimes it's price we talk about. So, someone's trying to sell a house. They're just stubborn on the price. No, this is what I want. This is what I'm going to get. 6 months go by, the listing expires, and then they call me or another agent up and say, well, I want to sell this property. Last agent couldn't get it done. And then next thing you know, they lower that price like the agent was probably telling them, and miraculously the property sells. Well, they did a better job. No, it was nine times out of 10, it's all about the price. And obviously there's marketing and other things that go into that. It's not just plug it in the computer and let it go, because there is a difference in marketing. But at a certain point, when you've done everything you can do, it's like you said with the person who's smoking and has emphysema. Well, if you're going to keep smoking, there's nothing we can do about that. But that's reality, and that's what happens. And sometimes the sign sits in the yard for 6 months. Other times, like you said, they finally get religion and do what you're telling them to do.
I think the dirty little secret I learned a long time ago in the realty business is the fact that, hey, you guys got free advertising.
Yeah.
At this property, because people aren't necessarily looking at the batting average. Like how long did it take you to sell a house? Most people don't really look under the hood or kick the tires for a prospective realtor. They usually, they hire a friend. Oh, if I don't have them list the house, my friendship's gone. The reality is that that's not a good way to sell a house, is to hire.
No. And I've got an interesting stat for you, Mike. About 70% of sellers hire the first realtor they meet. So whether it's a referral, old friend, family member, whoever it is, 70% of the time they hire the first person they meet. And the other thing, speaking of the dirty little secret, is that unfortunately there's a lot of agents who don't really have a backbone. And what I mean by that is they'll take any listing at any price because, like you said, they get to put up a sign, but they're kind of wishy-washy. They're not able to say to a seller, no, I'm not listing that property for $300,000. It's not good for you. And here's why. And they don't want to have that discussion. They'd rather just say yes and stick the sign up. And then in 30 days say, well, it didn't sell yet. Would you like to lower the price? And some of them don't even do that. They'll just wait. And then the seller might say, hey, it's been 30 days. Do you think we should lower the price? That should never be the case. The patient should never be telling the doctor, hey, do you think you should cut me here?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I remember when we started working together, about 10 years ago, I was appalled at some of the situations I saw that my customers were going through trying to sell their house. I remember going to one house in particular. I'd recommended this realtor who we had done work with before, and they trusted me implicitly because we had worked for them for over 20 years, and now they're getting ready to sell. So I go over to this house, and this is a tough, now we're in a tough market. 10 years ago, 09, 2010, real tough market, and not a lot of room for error here. And they called me up and said, we're not getting any offers. And, so-and-so says, well, it's a slow market. I went over to the house. It was empty. They had moved to their condo. The windows were dirty. There was paint chipping everywhere inside, and the grass was, hadn't been cut. I mean, this was in the late winter, but it was still overgrown, and the beds and the windows, and I think there was even a shutter hanging off the house. And I called the realtor and I said, how come you're not doing this? And you know what the person said to me? Well, they never asked. And of course, when I call the customer, they're saying, well, they never said we had to do anything. And my eyes started opening up to the lack of proactivity. And when you're in a bad market, you better have the best realtor there who's going to walk you through what you need to do to get out of this house without losing your shirt. And sometimes you're going to need to put some money into it. And of course, what happened is I went in there and put together a punch list, wash the windows, clean up the beds, cut the grass, trim the, edge of the sidewalk, put the shutter up, do, some work inside, clean it up, wash this. And they got an offer in a week.
Yeah, you coined an interesting term back then, Mike. I'm sure you remember this. You called it realtor malpractice, which is another medical analogy, of course. But to relay that or compare it to today's market, it's the same thing, but in reverse. If you're selling, there is margin for error because of how good the market is, and you won't even know that you left money on the table possibly. But if you're buying, it's like it was for sellers back then. If you're buying and you don't have a skillful professional helping you, you're already behind. You're giving everybody else a head start because they have someone good advising them and helping them win the property they're trying to buy.
Yeah. It was just shocking to go in there. And I used to see this in the contracting side because we would I'd go out to an estimate. I'd talk to a customer and they would say, I hate this kitchen. I hate the way this kitchen looks. And they were prepared to spend $50,000 on this kitchen, doing the conventional, tear out the cabinets, do this. And I said, wait a minute, let's step back here. The cabinets are fine. All they need to do is we can, spray them and get new pulls, new fixtures. We don't need to change this. We need to get a new counter, and we definitely need to get a new floor and some new lighting. Okay. It was a $15,000 to $20,000 job. And then we'd show them a mock-up, on a laptop, what it would look like. And invariably, it was all, what did they hate about the kitchen? They hated the color of the counter and they hated the floor. You take those two things out, all of a sudden the kitchen looks differently. But everyone prior to me coming out would say the same thing. Well, we don't do that. We just do the one approach, which is to gut it, new cabinets, X, Y, Z. And people think that's the only way that you can upgrade a kitchen. Now, imagine you can expand on that when you're getting a house ready to sell. And it's a normal market. It's not an overheated market like it is today. And it's not, coming out of a crash depression like it was in 2009, 2010. There's a checkbox of what you need to do to get the house ready to sell, and it's real low bar stuff. Wash windows, curb appeal, not, grass cutting and stuff like that. You need to make sure that your realtor and a contractor like me has a strategic plan of what you're going to put in and what you're going to get out. And obviously in a hot market, you don't need to put as much in now. 10 years ago, you needed to put a lot in. It had to be just the top 5% for it to sell.
Yeah, you had to be the pretty girl at the front of the class. Otherwise, you'd get overlooked.
So, medical malpractice, rescuing a deal, making sure that the patient is following the doctor's advice. My final thought on just the similarities between contracting, we would probably, let's say we do 300 jobs, big and small, over the course of a year with our business. And, that's some kitchens, some baths, some rehab, some gutter cleaning, some small repairs, so let's just say they're 300. Invariably, in my early years, there'd be a couple of customers, and they would always say the same thing with me. I've always had problems with a contractor. And most of the time, there was a reason why they had problems with a contractor, because they wanted to be the contractor. Okay. And they were constantly boxing their own contractor into a corner. It's like those people that want to sell a $200,000 house for $300,000. They want to paint the house, and they only want to paint it for $1,000. I mean, they're just totally unrealistic. So what I decided to do, and you heard me say this, 2% of your customers give you 98% of your headaches. You eliminate those 2%, and trust me, your year is going to be not only profitable, but a lot less stress-free. So a good realtor, folks, is like a good doctor. They're going to tell you what you need to do, and you have to trust them.
Yeah, I love it, Mike. That's Pareto's law. And, Pareto's law is more of the 80-20 rule, but obviously you did a good job vetting your customers if you only had to flesh out 2% of them.
Yeah, well, and then I have to be, to be fair to customers, sometimes people you'd go over there and they start barking away like, oh, well, I don't know, I've had a lot of problems with a contractor. And you know what? Their problems were legitimate.
Sure.
The guy didn't show up on time. He didn't return their phone call. He would forget to do certain things. They were constantly on them to clean up at the end of the day. I mean, just a lot. They were the foreman. The customer was the foreman. And
Right.
So they were burned. And I learned a long time ago that when I had a customer like that, I would always tell them, listen, I don't want you to be the foreman. And they'd stop and they'd think about that. And it would just connect. And they'd look at me and say, exactly. I don't want to, nobody wants to be reminding somebody to do something. It's like going out to dinner at a restaurant. Hey, can we get, where's our entree? Or we ordered something. It's not here yet. You don't want to do that. And so the same thing applies with the realtor. You want somebody coming in here who's going to drive the car. They have a plan. It all adds up. It's not rocket science.
Yep, I'm with. Yeah. Final thought is it's the same thing. Yeah, it's great analogies. We always come up with these great analogies, but it's the same thing with real estate. Going back to that stat I shared with you, the 70%, 70% of people use the first realtor they meet. I suspect that in the same way that customers aren't doing their research like they should on realtors, it's probably the same thing with contractors. Hey, the contractor was nice. He answered the phone. He showed up that first time. But, there's a lot more to it than just showing up that first time. So I think that's a great lesson to be taken from this.
Okay, well, we'll end on that note. And next week, we've got to revisit your Paris, your French client.
Oh, yeah. That's still an ongoing saga. So, yeah, hopefully by next week, I have an update for you on that one. That's a good story.
Okay, well, we're gonna revisit that. So,
very good,
folks. We'll be talking to you next week. Okay.
All right. Have a great day.
Okay. See you, Mike. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Cleveland Real Estate Investor Podcast. You can find all our episodes at www.reilly-properties.com, or you can find us on your favorite streaming services like Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, and more.